Let's talk about whether or not any of this is even necessary. Now, we had an extraordinary reaction to an interview I did last week with Dr. Mike Yeadon. He's the former chief scientific advisor with Pfizer, the major pharmaceutical company. And he, along with many others, including Carl Hennigan, the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, and I really defy anyone to question those credentials, have been questioning whether or not we are, well, horribly overreacting to a virus that, like all viruses, we are going to have to learn to live with, and big question marks over whether or not the policies with many Western governments, including the UK's, have been following over the recent months are actually having any effect at all. Well, let's talk about all of this once again with Dr. Mike Yeadon, back, I think, quite literally by popular demand. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Nice to be back.
Lovely to talk to you. We've had almost 100,000 views on YouTube of your video. Lots of reaction on Twitter. A lot of people just saying, great to actually hear someone sort of expand this. Now, let's just talk about some really basic stuff here. We saw yesterday 3,991 positive cases for coronavirus. It's up 50% in a week. You can understand why huge numbers of people are incredibly worried that we're seeing that uptick in cases. Should we be worried?
Well, thanks for having me back, Julia. So, of course, I definitely don't want to dismiss the possibility that these numbers are real and that people will get ill and potentially go to hospital or even die. But the evidence to date, I think, suggests that all or a substantial part of these positives could be due to what's called false positive tests. Now, government knows that the PCR test is very sensitive, and all tests have a propensity to throw up a particular false positive rate. What's really frustrating, Julie, and your listeners should know this, the government doesn't know what the false positive rate is, or if it does, it's not declaring it and continuing with the assumption that it's zero, and it's definitely not zero. And Carl Hennigan did a calculation, and he showed that if the false positive rate is as little as 0.1%, then more than half the positive tests are in fact false or fake. And I think the false positive rate is probably much higher, possibly 1%. And if that's true, most or all of the positives are actually false, and they're not infected, infectious or ill.
And the key thing there is, of course, I mean, again, for those of us who are not medically trained or scientifically trained, or indeed a great mathematics either, it's because the actual percentage of people who are being tested positive is a tiny percentage. So if you have a false positive rate at that level, you actually are accounting for effectively all of the positive test results. And this comes down to how they're testing and how they carry out these cycles to sort of try and get particles of a virus. And as far as I can understand it seems to be along the lines of the fact that we are finding traces of the old virus, basically dead virus that's been caught 6 months ago, that could not possibly make the person ill currently and could not possibly be infectious to other people, in which case we're finding 3,991 cases of people, largely of people who may or may not have had the virus in the past or don't have the virus at all, in which case not much to worry about.
Yes, I do think just a couple of things. So you're absolutely right. We know that, because it's been shown, that people who've recovered from the virus and they're clinically well, and you can no longer culture virus from a sample from their mouth or airways, still can be positive in the PCR test. And that's because, as you say, the test is not a test for virus. It's not a test for living virus. The test looks for a particular piece of the genetic code. And if it finds a small piece of a dead virus that's still stuck in your mucus and is being shed from cells, you could still be positive on a swab test for a long time. So that's what I think is a significant contribution. And the other one is just intrinsically that tests occasionally, statistically, throw up false positives. And as you say, a very good point, Julia, that the ONS survey still says that the prevalence of the virus is very low, which is good, less than 0.1%. So if we find 2% positives and yet no one's ill, I'm worried that specifically Matt Hancock's Pillar 2 test is flawed.
That's community testing. That's people who are going to school, going to work and getting tested. Yeah.
Yes. And I think, did you see on the TV the other day, they showed a little clip of people beavering away on a line of white tables, looked like big picnic tables, and they were in something that, for all the world, looked like a marquee tent. Mm-hmm. And there were some, people casting around, wearing gloves and so on. I think if they're really doing the tests or processing the samples there, you've got to be kidding. Imagine this was a test in a forensic case in law, because this is the same kind of thing. They use PCR to try and prove you are or are not the guilty party. But if you were doing your forensic work in a tent like that, the lawyer would just throw it out and say, don't believe it.
Right, that's a fair point. Now, what about the argument that, okay, a load of these may be false positives, a load of these people are not a risk to themselves or others, but we are following behind countries like Spain and France. They've also seen a big uptick in the number of cases, although they're not testing at the same level. And they are now, and we're 3 weeks behind them, they are now seeing an uptick in people getting into hospital and in terms of deaths. And we are now seeing that uptick in hospitalizations and in deaths. Is that not evidence that we should be worried that we are heading into the so-called second wave?
Yeah, no, so it's a fair question. I will tell you, I'm very humble and very worried that if I'm wrong, I would hate to sort of mislead people. But I did check this morning, and the number of COVID deaths, at least in NHS England, is continuing to stay low and falling. So I can't tell you what the ITU, the intensive care state is, or number of admissions, but it has fallen constantly for 6 months. So for it now to turn and increase, we would have to have some big change in transmission. So let me just comment on something. I've read a paper by somebody that's made me rethink the data. You know the story going around at the moment that very many more young people are testing positive in this PTR test, and people have said, oh well, it must be the young people are interacting with each other as they do and not obtaining looking at social distancing. Well, that's possible, but I always felt that was implausible, because young people felt rightly less at risk from this virus from the get-go. And as my children in their 20s have said, what, Dad, young people have not been spending as much time social distancing. So what I'm saying is they would have caught it. They would have been the first people to have caught it and survived. So the idea that now, 6 months later, the young people are selectively getting it, I just think that's for the birds. And I read a paper yesterday by a pathologist who's looked at this data and come up with a different and dramatic conclusion. She says, this is Claire Craig in Spectator, she says, if the positive tests are false, they will be distributed evenly across the population, whether you're young or old. And you know what? That's what we're finding. Now, 19% of the positive tests are in the under 20s, whereas during the pandemic, only 2% of the cases were in young people. So she's saying it's now spread evenly. So it's either that the virus is even, or more likely that it's just it's a feature of testing lots of people and it's just false positives.
So the bizarre thing, we're being told the answer to coming out of this this predicament we're in and avoiding a second lockdown across the country or curfews and the like, saving Christmas, the Prime Minister has said in an interview with The Sun. The answer is more testing. But if we've got testing that is showing up so many false positives and people who are not infectious, who are not at risk, the risk, of course, is that more testing creates more cases, creates more worry, is more likely to lead us to have a curfew and lockdown, in which case...
Yes.
Well, what is the answer if it's not testing then?
Okay, so I've got the answer. One comment, Sweden is not doing mass testing, and so far their society is not riven with ill people going to hospital and dying. And the reason I mention it is that they have had the same percentage of their population succumb and die, 0.06%, as we have had in UK, and over the same timescale. So I think it is at least worth looking at what they're doing. But I'm going to repeat to Matt Hancock the same challenge I made last week, which is that you're using a test with an undeclared false positive rate, which I think is dreadful because it's having a big impact on people. If you don't know what it is, shame on you. And if you do know what it is, you must disclose it. And finally, some advisors have issued to you guidance to retest the positives before declaring them. Are you doing that? We'd all be more satisfied. If they're genuinely infected and really got the virus, most of the time they'll test positive again. I think a lot of them being false positives will not test positive if you immediately repeat them. And that's good practice. That's the advice to the minister. Why isn't he doing that?
That's certainly a challenge we'll be putting to the Health Secretary next time we speak to him. You brought up Sweden, and this has been a very big issue. Sweden, famously being the country that didn't go into a formal lockdown, they went into a semblance of lockdown in terms of it was voluntary. It was advice about social distancing, but pubs and bars stayed open, schools stayed open for all children up to the age of 16. They don't wear masks. People just largely getting on with normal life and being fairly sensible. All the evidence then is pointing, as you say, given the similar death rates around the Europe, and again, where they do differ, there are large factors that can explain that, which are quite separate from what governments have done or not done. Do you think that actually our best hopes of getting through this will actually be following what Sweden has done rather than, say, a second lockdown? And what are your fears if we did go into some version of a second lockdown, leaving aside the economic effects, but the health effects of a second lockdown in terms of coronavirus?
Yes, I think if we have a second lockdown, I think we're going to amplify the negative effects. Forget the economy. It's very important. Forget the economy. If we have another lockdown, I think we're going to amplify the non-COVID deaths that I think have happened already, and we're not much talking about them. It's as if there's no other health condition in the country worth paying attention to. And the consequence of locking down and restricting access to the health service in case there's a second wave, because that's an official policy that they've not bothered to tell you about, I think that's going to have, and has already had, the consequence of killing or allowing to die savable people from non-COVID illness. And I think so. Lockdown, I wouldn't do it. Let me just mention briefly, it is now established our lockdown, our national lockdown, occurred too late to make any difference to the initial spread of the virus. Even, I think, Professor Chris Whitty accepts this. So think about it. We didn't introduce masks until quite recently, and our lockdown was too late to prevent the initial spread. I assert that actually what has happened in UK is very similar to Sweden. We made efforts that were distinct and different, but I don't think they made any difference because lockdown was too late and masks very much later. So it wouldn't be surprising if we've had the same lethality, the same population percentage who have died, unfortunately, then why aren't we in the same place? And it's worth noting, I had a quick look around the data in Africa, and if mass population immunity is not keeping the numbers of illnesses and deaths, for example, in Malawi, right on the floor. The imperial projection was for tens of thousands to die. I think they've had 250. So, and a virologist from that country has said, I can think of no other explanation than mass population immunity to explain the difference between the model and what's happening.
And that's the question of whether or not we actually do now have enough population immunity to stop an exponential spread. We will, as we head into autumn and winter, we will see more people dying, but that is the nature of these respiratory diseases.